Good morning, everyone. ICRIER and LIRNEasia welcomes you to our event on research dissemination of online freelancing challenges, opportunities, and impact in India. I request everyone to come in and settle down, and we'll start soon. Thank you.
Dr. Krishnan, yeah. Thank you, Gangesh, and good morning, everybody. A very warm welcome to ICRIER. Dr. K.P. Krishnan, Secretary, Ministry of Skill Development and Entrepreneurship, Government of India. Helani Galpaya, Chief Executive Officer, LIRNEasia, based out of Colombo in Sri Lanka. All the speakers in the panel discussion. Harsh is already here, Dr. Harshvardhan Singh, who's the Executive Director, Brookings, Dr. Manish Kumar, who will be here shortly, Managing Director and CEO of National Skill Development Corporation, Sanjeev Bikhchantani, the co-founder of Naukri.com. Friends, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome once again to this dissemination seminar on online freelancing, challenges, opportunities, and impact in India, which we are doing in collaboration with LIRNEasia, and Helani is representing LIRNEasia here, and Lalima is also here. Welcome to ICRIER, with the support, as you see, of UK Aid and IDRC Canada. This is a project that we developed along with Helani several months ago, and we were very excited about the possibility of working in this space. This is the first that we have attempted to do this. Unfortunately, what you will see during the panel discussion is that the scope is immense, but as of now, it's in its nascent stage. So we are, in some sense, LIRNEasia and ICRIER are pioneers in this field of online freelancing and micro work, but I think it's a very exciting area. Exciting for several reasons because, as you know, India is going through a huge demographic transition like it's never seen before. We've had significant growth in India over the last couple of decades, and we've had very rapid economic growth, and there have been benefits of economic growth, both in terms of increasing our per capita incomes, and there have been benefits of economic growth, especially in terms of reducing the number of people who live below the poverty line. If you recall, one of the big statistics of economic growth between 2004 and 2009, which sometimes we call as the golden period of India's growth, was that we were able to kind of remove 140 million people out of poverty. So growth has been very good for the Indian economy because it's had an impact on poverty, and it's obviously had an impact on per capita income. Since then, growth has tapered off, but hopefully it will revive in the future. But there are two other grave challenges that confront us. And those two grave challenges, of course, are one relating to the fact that our manufacturing sector hasn't delivered the kind of growth that we saw in China before us, and then before that in Korea and in Japan, i.e. it hasn't been labor intensive. It's not been able to absorb the labor that has been released from agriculture and into manufacturing. Instead, that labor, that demographic transition in India has been sort of non-customary in the sense that it hasn't replicated the kind of transition that we saw in other East Asian countries. And that's created problems for us. And then, given the fact that our population bulge, especially in the middle between 15 and 54, is going to become even larger as we move along over the course of the next couple of decades. I don't know how many of you know that we will be the largest country in terms of population in 2030, and we will have 1.7 billion people living in India in 2050, with a labor force, believe it or not, of 1.1 billion. I mean, that's just the labor force, not the population. So it's a huge challenge. So anything that we can do to sort of address that challenge in terms of creating productive employment opportunities, which unfortunately, as I said, the manufacturing sector, which is supposed to be lift the people out of poverty, especially the unskilled, because that's where our comparative advantage is, that's not delivered in the country. But we can't remove the focus from manufacturing, although we can't now only focus on manufacturing, because if you remember the example of Korea and Japan, is that the manufacturing sector was export-led in a sense. So all those productivity enhancements and scale that came from manufacturing came due to the fact that they were also export-oriented, and therefore they were, technological diffusion happened as a result of openness, competitiveness improved, and therefore they were able to absorb their growing labor force. We probably will not have that luxury because the rest of the world is becoming a little more protectionist than before, but I don't think, I may be wrong, but I don't think we can remove the focus from manufacturing. It has to become all-inclusive in the sense that now people talk about the servicification of manufacturing. So services are likely to be embedded in manufacturing. And I think there's a long way for us to go. It's going to be, as I said, a hard grind for us. But happily, technology, as you know, the fourth industrial revolution, as people often call it, has both positives and negatives. And I think it will be much more beneficial and rewarding for us to focus on the positives. Of course, we know that jobs will be destroyed, there will be damage to jobs, but it will change the nature of the labor market in India. And most of you know that the labor market in India is highly, in some sense, it's been described variously as, informal, contractualization of the labor force. So 90% of India's workforce is in the informal sector, and some people say it's even less. So that, I think, distinction between formal and informal is perhaps going to become, I think technology is just going to overcome that. I mean, when you talk about formal, you talk about, social security benefits that are linked to your job. With greater informalization of the kind that we're going to speak about in the panel discussion, in the sense that people now, especially the youngsters, I call myself and our young team from ICRIER sitting here, I often call myself as a digital immigrant because we work so much on the internet and these platforms. I am the digital immigrant, and there's a 12, 13-year-old, well, maybe 19-year-old in our team who are digital natives. I mean, they are born with a digital instrument in their hand, and there are so many sort of jokes going around in WhatsApp that parents are beginning to learn about digital economy and the digital use of digital platforms for their children. And in the United States, I was astounded when I read this number. 40% of the new entrants to the workforce do not want to have a regular 9-to-5 job. 40%. And they are in there, obviously, what you call digital immigrants or the digital natives or the millennials, however you want to describe them. They are working out of cafes, they are working with their internet. Of course, in the United States, you have broadband speeds, you have good speeds. This is something that we're going to discuss with respect to India, and maybe Helani will discuss with respect to the greater South Asian region, including Myanmar and Sri Lanka. But the point being is that distinction between formal and informal linked to social security benefits, that might not be very compelling and persuasive anymore. So we have to begin to think about a new way to describe our labor markets. Of course, we need to liberalize our labor laws. That's without question. We need to liberalize our labor laws, but we also have to develop new thinking about the way we think about labor data, labor markets, how we collect data on employment, etc. And I think the government is beginning to think about it, and I'm really grateful that Dr. K.P. Krishnan is here, and as you know, that he's Secretary of the Skills in Government of India. And skills is another thing that we're going to talk about. So we have to improve not only our physical infrastructure to be able to deliver, hopefully, the jobs that we need, but we also need to match demand and supply, match the skills to the needs. And, digital platforms enable us to do that. So what I would say is that you should all see this as sort of pioneering work, pioneering in the sense of first work in the Indian context, so trying to look at this market of online freelancing, online outsourcing, and micro work. There have been several case studies that have been done before us, but this is the first attempt to integrate this. This is not the end. I would say this is just the beginning of what we want to do in this space, recognizing that I think India has a grave sort of jobs problem. And I think India's fate as an economy is inextricably linked or tied to its ability to create jobs. And India's fate as an economic superpower will be dependent upon how it's able to create those jobs and where those jobs are going to come from. So as I said, technology must be seen as an enabler. It will destroy jobs. Focus on the positives. What are the skills we need? What are the education levels? How is this going to happen? Which sectors are going to be impacted? All that we will hopefully discuss in the panel discussion. But I must say that at least I and the team that has worked extensively in this, are very excited about the possibility of this work and extending this work to looking at, I think, the broader question, future of work. And I think this will feed into that work that we are going to do in the future. So once again, thank you all very much for coming, and I hope you have a productive seminar. And we would, as I said, since this is a sort of, if you give me the license to be a little pompous, if not pioneering, at least the initial work, we'll welcome your suggestions on how we can improve the work and how we can make it more relevant to the policy context in India. So look forward to all your participation, and I see a lot of eminent people here. Thank you very much for coming. Especially, I want to thank Dr. Krishnan once again for sparing time. The Parliament is on, and he has to be on this, appear before a committee. So really thankful to Dr. K.P. Krishnan for coming, and also very thankful to Helani for giving us this opportunity to work together. ICRIER has worked with LIRNEasia. We're old friends, the two institutions. We worked with them before, but it's really exciting to work on a contemporary and a topical issue. So thank you all very much. May I request Helani now to make her opening remarks? Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Rajat. It is indeed a pleasure to be working again. I think the last time we worked on was looking at the app economy in India, young software developers creating mobile phone apps for the global market. So it is very good to be working with everybody. And Dr. Krishnan, Secretary, Ministry of Skills Development and Entrepreneurship, very much appreciate you taking the time to be here. And all the guests, including Dr. Harshvardhan Singh, who is an old friend of LIRNEasia, having worked on infrastructure issues long ago before he went into sort of multilateral work in his life. And welcome to everybody. I think it is really important that we look at this, as Rajat says, as the first stage of what is a long discussion in India and in our part of the world. And I think it's important because as a regional think tank, we work in South Asia and Southeast Asia in about 11 countries. And the narrative about digitization and labor that we hear in many parts of the world that we work in this region, is actually quite different from the narrative that we hear in the global conferences where the American, European points of view are present. So, I mean, obviously, Sri Lanka, where I come from, and India and this region has greatly benefited, for the past 10, 15 years. Because of technology and telecommunications, the huge contributions the IT and the IT-enabled sector makes is well documented. And there was a lamentation in the developed world about how jobs are being outsourced because of technology, and we benefited from that, right, to a great extent. And now the narrative is about how technology is further changing work in the sense that a job is made up of a series of tasks. And depending on which job, a certain number of these tasks are likely to be automated. And now I think we are beginning to see this, particularly in India. The press is sort of small, but there's enough buzz. For example, if you look at the software testing work that is done by some of the large Indian outsourcing IT-enabled services software houses, software engineers and particularly testers are being laid off because the testing scripts are now increasingly automated, right? So automation is changing even in our part of the world. So in the large corporations, that narrative has started and will probably get disintermediated by even cheaper labor markets in our region and increasingly in Africa. In the small medium enterprises, the narrative of what technology is doing and whether we are at threat is less clear. There's been some work, for example, done by Vignesh Ilavarasan, who's a professor at IIT Delhi, and he actually concludes that the threat of digitization to small medium enterprises is much less than we see in the West, just because there are so many SMEs who operate without electricity, so what technology? And also SMEs who operate with low levels of technology already, so there's less opportunity for technology to disintermediate. And we are looking at sort of the global narrative of the low-end service jobs, which are getting so low end that wages are very squeezed, but they will not go away because those service jobs somebody has to do. Then at the high-end service jobs are fine. They are safe because they are knowledge work. It's the middle end, the middle income jobs that are likely to get disintermediated due to trade and digitization. So in this context, what Rajat and we did was to actually look at a very specific type of work. This is sort of what we call pure mode 4 trade. That is pure remote trade where the buyer and the worker don't meet. Their transaction is intermediated by a digital platform, and the work is done and transacted, and often payment is also done either through this platform or another payment mechanism, and the buyer and seller do not have to meet. And often these are individual providers of labor, that is individual workers, and often, but not always, individual buyers. And again, our narrative is very different to what we hear in, let's say, the European Union, where there's a lamentation about people who used to have jobs before now becoming platform workers and gig workers, and how terrible this is, and how they do not have pensions and social safety schemes. In many of our countries, many workers didn't have social safety schemes to begin with. It was already informal. And in fact, what some of these jobs are doing is, for a lot of them, it's bringing them into some form of the formal economy. That is, there is some trace of them. There is a digital record of their work. There's a digital record of their earnings. So there is also, therefore, an opportunity to include them in the formal economy in terms of consuming financial services and so on. So we see this as an opportunity. This is not without threats, obviously, as with all things. So I look forward to a fruitful discussion. And may I then invite Dr. Krishnan to make his opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Helani, and thank you, Rajat. Good morning to all of you. It's genuinely a pleasure to be here at this conference on the theme of online freelancing challenge, opportunities and impact in India. It's actually quite fascinating to read through some of the material that Rajat shared with me yesterday. For example, it really came as a surprise to me that the Oxford University's online labor index, quoted in the study, estimates that India is among the largest supplier of online labor. It's a fairly large number, 24% of the workers observed. And the index reports that the top occupational category in the category observed expectedly includes software development and technology. But interestingly, multiple platforms ranging from rural BPOs to high-tech consulting services through a variety of very interesting contractual arrangements. Likewise, the other thing that I found interesting, I guess some of you who follow this would have known it, it really came as a surprise to me, that besides regular professionals, a significant proportion of online freelancers are students and who are doing freelancing while studying, alongside studying. In the sort of initial remarks that I propose to make now, I thought I'll set the context for the deliberations that will take place after tea by focusing on a key challenge that we are also dealing with inside the government, certainly in my ministry, namely coming to terms with the or coming to grips with the transformation of the world of work itself and the consequent challenge of how can we, as a society and using public policy, equip the youth of our country with the skills required to adapt to this rapidly challenging work environment. The transformation that I referred to earlier, as I see it, is, I think, being driven by three sets of drivers: technological change, on which you see a lot in this report; organizational change, including changes in the workplace; and changes in employment patterns and work. And let me briefly deal with each of these drivers. The first of the three major drivers is, and perhaps the most important, is clearly technological change. And new technologies, we've read about these in the Industry 4.0 context. New technologies such as automation, robotics, 3D printing, AI, machine learning are clearly transforming the nature of work in manufacturing and the service sectors. For example, the ILO study of 2016, an oft-quoted study, talks about how in textile manufacturing, one of the largest absorbers of labor in our part of the world, the manufacturers have now developed robots and material handling systems that completely stitch pieces of fabric together. They pick them up, they move them to the next set of machines, and this entire category of a job role called sewing machine operators would be rendered completely irrelevant and has already been rendered irrelevant in countries such as Cambodia, where a lot of this technology is already being implemented, and close to 500,000 sewing machine operators are perhaps facing the threat of being unemployed. Likewise, the same ILO study of 2016 talks about Thailand, a country that we are all familiar with in terms of its great retail shopping spaces, where close to 1 million plus, 1.5 million is the number that the ILO estimate talks about, clerks and other workers in the retail space who are likely to lose their jobs owing to automation. Significant numbers. Likewise, the other example, the 2015 report on Foxconn, the mobile manufacturer, where it talks about close to 70% of its current operations in manufacturing of mobiles being rendered completely automated by 2018, barely a couple of weeks away, where 70% of their workforce will actually be rendered irrelevant by new technology. And we have similar studies in India, which most of you are familiar with. I don't want to belabor the point, but I think what's of importance to us is, as the ICRIER study points out, the risk of job destruction due to technological change can actually get transformed into an opportunity. And I think that's the part that I'd like to pick up, as clearly there are new job roles that are emerging, including in areas like online freelancing and micro work. And I think in that sense, today's conference is timely, as it will help us understand both the risks and the opportunities that India faces as a result of the technological changes of the kind that I mentioned. And I think clearly, as a society, as a government, we need to have a clearly focused strategy to overcome these risks and maximize the opportunities that will come along with these changes. The second driver that I want to briefly mention is the institutional change and the changes in workplaces and recruitment patterns. The job matching sites like LinkedIn and Monster are completely changing and expanding the way individuals now look for work and companies identify and recruit talent. In addition, the kind of independent workers that are now increasingly choosing to offer their services not in the form of the old system of employment, but more in the newer systems like Upwork, Uber, Etsy, and in the process, completely challenging conventional ideas about how and where work is done, how is work undertaken. And the other sort of immediate consequence, and which we face continuously in all our vocational training and skill development programs, is this complete blurring of boundaries between an employee, an entrepreneur, and a contractor. In a sense, every driver that we train in a simple driving school has ceased to be the employee that we trained him for or we trained her for, and is turning into an Uber or an Ola driver who at the same time is multiple roles sort of coming into one position. And it's interesting that instead of work-life balance, human resource managers are now talking about work-life integration and sort of creating alongside a whole host of newer risks and newer challenges. And online freelancing is, I think, a good example of work which often takes place in the gray area, both between informal and formal, as well as between permanent and contractual work. All our conventional sort of classifications and buckets will break down in the context of this kind of a system of work. On the one hand, this form of employment offers a large number of people who may have been otherwise constrained to take up full-time employment to work flexibly or part-time out of their homes. So as a consequence, for example, the issue that a lot of us who are dealing with labor issues are worried about, the reducing labor force participation rate amongst women, this could potentially be a very important opportunity to, once we understand the phenomenon fully, this could potentially be a great opportunity to deal with the lowering LFPR for women. But at the same time, I think these opportunities also create a whole new human resource paradigm, which, as I mentioned earlier, completely moves away from the concept of work-life balance and the challenges that work-life integration will now throw up and the risks that it throws up are things that we need to handle. 3, the third driver I want to briefly mention before I conclude is the sort of increasingly precarious nature of work and employment. Clearly, the industrial transformation that Rajat mentioned and that's taking place is creating very different kinds of risks and opportunities for high and low skill jobs, and the consequences in terms of employment and unemployment for young people is something we need to be worried about. There's clear, I guess, initial evidence about the stagnating incomes for a large number of households. And the ILO estimates, the same study that I referred to earlier, about future production systems and current recruitment trends, which would make workers with lower skills and female workers in particular very much more vulnerable than they are today. Now, we see the consequences in India in terms of hiring practices which are already making workers vulnerable. The evidence that we have in terms of movement of a large number of workers from regular to contractual, in fact, the explosive increase in the number that we see in all of those hugely labor-absorbing sectors in terms of the increase in the contractual workers, though not entirely a consequence of freelancing, but phenomenon similar to these is something which public policy would need to come to grips with. And clearly, these challenges that I mentioned will affect job roles in online freelancing, where workers clearly, the initial evidence that I saw, earn lower wages compared to their, I'm talking about international comparison, workers in India vis-a-vis workers elsewhere. In addition, their income varies depending on the kind of projects that they undertake. Now, the absence of a steady stream of income could also mean that those who work in such job roles are likely to be vulnerable to sort of financial risk. And how does one create a mechanism in the formal financing system to handle all of these, though not directly within the purview of labor, is another consequence that we need to look at. So, in the sort of light of all this, the ICRIER study is, I think, important and in terms of the questions that it raises for policymakers. And I'm sure that the deliberations that will take place in the afternoon post-tea will look at all of these. I'd like to sort of mention here the point that Helani mentioned in her initial remarks in terms of how the rest of the world is handling this and sort of seizing the initiative in setting the terms of this debate. Some of you may be aware about the ILO Global Commission on the Future of Work. And it's may not be aware that there are 2 Indians in this commission, including the former Secretary General of FICCI, Dr. Didar Singh. Both the Ministry of Labour, Government of India and Skill Development are working closely with him to make sure that this Global Commission on the Future of Work, which will, over a period of time, have an influence on the emerging agenda internationally, is something which is fully supported by work that we have done, by research that we have done. It may be very useful for ICRIER also to engage with Dr. Didar Singh. I'll be happy to mention it to him in the light of the kind of work that you've done. I think it will be useful to give him a lot of these inputs so that the global debate is also fully informed by the kind of developments and the kind of concerns that we have, which are not necessarily identical to the concerns that are being brought to the table by the more developed countries. So I think in a sense, this conference couldn't have come at a more opportune time. I'd be happy to take away from this post the afternoon session whatever is it that we need to incorporate in our own policies in the Ministry of Skill Development, and happy to be part of any further deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, sir. And we'll now break for tea. Thank you.
So we'll come back with the presentation and the panel discussion in about 15 minutes. Please have your tea. And thank you once again for your patience.